Hello,
Hi, I'm Steve from Lily Wild, and I'm here today with,
I'm Catherine Allen, come up from Shrewsbury in Shropshire. We're here on holiday for a week.
and we're actually up in Scotland in the Highlands near to Fort William and Ben Nevis, many of you may have heard of. Anyway, Catherine, we've known each other quite a long time.
Wow, that's what, 20 years?
Something
Must
like
be
that.
like that.
Yeah,
Must be
something
20
like
years
that.
now.
So I'm really interested because a lot of the people I talk to will say, oh, I've worked in this and then I did that and then I've worked in this. And over the years, I've known you work in quite a few things, but I've also known you actually only really working in one kind of trend, one kind of direction. And it's a lot of the time being to do with environment and development.
Yes.
I think those are probably the two words that
the
spring
point
into my
where
head.
people interact with those in particular.
So could you tell me a little bit about that kind of work history, how you got to where you are?
Ooh, gosh, how did I get into that? Well, my dad was a geologist, so my early memories were always going out into the field with him.
Right.
So I loved being outside. I always liked that kind of thing. And I was very interested in agriculture. So my first degree was around agriculture, but I felt like there was something missing,
Yeah.
and it was people. And that took me into medicine and parasitology, because then you've got
Okay.
sort of land
Right.
use, human
Yeah.
sort of interaction and things like that. Popped out of all of that just as the UK government, the Department for International Development, was thinking through livelihoods.
Right.
So the idea of putting people at the centre of development.
And this is overseas development
this is
in
overseas,
poorer countries
yes.
where,
Yeah, so this is
developing
overseas
economies.
development.
Yeah.
And it was trying to have a more joined up look at the things that influenced people and things that people had influence over in terms of their environment, but environment in its broadest sense, so
Yeah.
not just the natural environment but also political environment and,
Right.
and community and things like that.
Yeah.
And that just resonated with me.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And it just brought everything together for me, and I followed that through, mainly focused around rural development,
Yeah.
particularly overseas. Rural communities are very much disadvantaged. They're a long way from government, they're a long way from services, they're a long way from everything. Much more reliant on themselves and their natural environment. So yeah, and that's pretty much where I've worked. But then I met you because that then sort of translated into doing more work in the UK, where there's so much crossover.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I'd done, as you know, I mean, I'd worked in the UK, then I did some in overseas development, and then I tended to work mainly in the UK, but still did some overseas development work as well, and much the same as yourself, really. Slightly different reasons, background, but it was definitely that thing about people and nature, and where's that point where it all comes together and makes some sense. So one of the things I think often, I mean, somebody actually said to me the other day, I said something, oh, so and so works in development, and they said, but what does that mean?
It's a good question. Yes, I don't know how best to describe it, but it's different. I think it's a much more open environment to engage with different issues. I think you can be talking to a government minister one minute, you could be sitting in a community and talking with sort of women in the community that afternoon. You could be talking to a water sort of resource specialist. You could be talking to a social sort of safety net specialist. It's a lot more integrated, simply because there's less available. I think that's the best way of describing it. Whereas
maybe less infrastructure as well, less segmentation of infrastructure.
And siloed and things like that. The sort of work I've done in the UK, you tend to find it's much more sort of sectorally sort of squeezed, and you don't get involved with the other department or the other area of work. It's much more challenging to get people to sit and talk across different subjects. That doesn't it's a different type of environment. I think it's just simply because we have the resources to get really into depth on issues.
Oh, sounds like we just got one of the local trades going by. Not the stalker. Anyway,
Not the stalker,
sorry,
no.
I talked over you slightly there. Yeah. No, it's interesting with the point you raised there, because it's something I've reflected on a number of times, and we're looking now at a situation in all countries of trying to integrate almost nature back into people's lives and to be more in balance. And something that you're talking about there in terms of, so development is working in another country, helping them look at how they are going to develop in a way that is both beneficial for people but also not damaging their environment, and hopefully improving their standard of living, improving their healthcare and so on. I think that's a simple way of sort of summarising, isn't it? And what you've described there is the fact that when you're working in that environment, you're able to sort of cross over both sectorally, go into lots of different sectors, but you can also cross over hierarchically in terms of you can go up and down more easily. Maybe partly that old thing of coming in from the outside allows you to break the rules. But it's also something about thinking then in terms of how we move forward. Have we actually created ourselves a whole load of barriers? And I wonder if, from your perspective of sort of doing a bit in the UK and a bit overseas, do you think we've actually created silos that are making it harder for us to learn across sectors from one another and find the right solutions?
I would say probably yes. And actually, having worked in the UK, I've come across quite a few examples of that. I did some work with Sure Start, and I think it was through Resource for Change, where we were teaching elderly people participatory tools to use for peer-to-peer interviewing. And it was
just going to get a timber lorry going past it. We've obviously hit rush hour in northwest Scotland. We've had two vehicles and there's another one on the way. But anyway, sorry. Yeah.
So they wanted to try and understand how it wasn't Sure Start, but it was Health Authority. They wanted to understand how elderly care was perceived by people who were receiving it. So they had the great idea of getting peers to interview each other. So we were training people to do that over the course of about 3 different workshops. And gradually they were starting to bring in stories, but the more stories that were coming in, the more the health staff, you could see sort of almost rabbit in headlights, because they're hearing things that they haven't necessarily ever heard before, or in context that they haven't heard before, and it frightened them. And they were starting to step away from this grand idea of having a big sort of participatory process. So that's one example. I've been in situations where I've fed back from work to an audience, and I've done it in a way that I would do in a development context to an audience, and I've included kind of quotes and what people have said and opinions and things like that. And I had an instant sort of kickback about, was it a statistically significant sample of people that you spoke to, and and where were the figures and the graphs? And thinking, you can have figures and graphs, but actually, the conversation I had with that single mum on the doorstep is really important. But they're not necessarily open to listening to that.
Yes, I've had very similar conversations and been challenged in the same way, and it's almost that you, I remember once actually making a graph of all the responses that come back on a series of issues, and all of the things that scored highest were the things that somebody would just react to in everyday life. And all the really, really important points had only actually been said by 1 or 2 people. So you ended up with this graph that looked really big, and then it tailed right the way down, and all the really important stuff was right down there in the tail. And I used that as a way of showing people actually just numerics wasn't necessarily going to tell you the whole story, and certainly not where you really needed to get into the depth of things. Which I thought was quite informative in itself, with it in a graph. This is staggering how many cars we're getting coming past. So I can't quite believe it.
But not a single eagle.
No eagles.
You promised me eagles.
We will. There's white-tailed eagles, white-tailed sea eagles nest very close to here. So we quite often get them behind us. So if every now and again one of us turns to have a quick look, that's what we're looking for. Yes, for those of you who don't know this part of the UK, they were reintroduced after many years of not being present because of persecution and slowly were killed off. And now they've started to build their numbers back up again. And we're lucky that we've got a few nest sites around here, which is great. So that's really interesting. So that took you into this kind of development work, and I know you've worked in lots of different countries around the world over the years. And you're currently working in a consultancy capacity. Is that the way, do you think, that much of the work in development happens, or how do people get involved in that sort of thing?
It's a tricky one, and I've had lots of people asking about that. Sort of young, sort of committed, enthusiastic people wanting to get in. And it's a challenge. It's almost like being in the right place at the right time. It's having that first break, and then it leads into multiple ones. Consultancy is still a very active area. You've got the sort of big international NGOs are still operating, but things are changing very much in the sector.
Right. So the international NGOs, for those of you who aren't there, that's like an international charity.
So like
NGO is
Oxfam
non-governmental organisation. So
things like that. So the big think piece for us at the moment is around what they call shifting the power.
Right.
Because realistically, me getting on a plane and going to another country and meddling in somebody else's affairs is, it's a bit arrogant. It's sort of smacks of colonialism. So the shifting the power agenda is very much about that sort of work being done much more at a local and national level by people who are living that experience, and away from people like myself. And I think that is completely the way it should go. But it's causing quite a lot of flux.
That's really interesting, because that feels to me like a very positive change that's started to take place. But you can also end up in this problem of the comment I made about the outsider can come in and break the rules also plays in reverse. The insider, it's much harder to break the rules. So if you're inside your own community and you're then a change maker, you're part of that community, it can quite often be hard to be the change maker as well. I know, talking to people in their own situations where they've really come up against that and been ostracised from their own communities. So do you think there'll still be a role for people coming in from outside? Not necessarily a European going to, I don't know, East Africa. It may be somebody from Kenya going to Zimbabwe or whatever. It may be more kind of, but still somebody coming in from outside.
Yes, I think it's really important, and I think it's one of the sort of benefits of being a consultant, because you have that opportunity of sort of almost sort of teleporting into an organisation or a situation, and you have the benefit of not being emotionally involved with it. So you can be a little bit more dispassionate about what you're seeing. You can actually see the patterns and the connections that others get lost in once you're involved with something. So you can start to unpick those and highlight things that have been missed by others, because they're seeing it every day, and it's no longer that important. And I think that kind of perspective is really important. It just helps people shift the way they're thinking, or to appreciate some of the things that they may have just been taken for granted. And it's those sort of little shifts that can help move things forward. I'm just finishing a piece of work at the moment for a Swiss organisation, and they've actually adopted that very agile, responsive, entrepreneurial approach to shifting policy dialogue around a particular issue forward. And they have the flexibility with their funding and the way they work to be able to see little leverage points and opportunities and say, actually, we'll just drop a little bit of money in here, or a little bit of technical assistance, and the whole thing moves forward very quickly. And it sort of stops the stagnation that can happen if you have a great idea, but you haven't got funding and there isn't any resources to move it forward, so nothing then moves forward and the momentum dies. And so that good idea just gets parked. They've found a way of just sort of stepping in and going, here you go. We don't want our name all over things, we're not after that, but we want to see that issue moving forward, so take that and run with it.
That's really interesting. So this, I mean, I feel that it's a sort of conversation we can have a lot more about, and it may be, if people are interested, do get in touch, because we can maybe do a bit of a workshop on this. But I think I've done a number of pieces of work myself where you've been in that, looking at what I call the trigger points or the pinch points, and you're working inside a complex system. It's constantly moving, things are all interacting, but you keep finding these little points. A very small change could make a really big difference. And a lot of the traditional contracts and a lot of the traditional ways that NGOs or others work don't allow you to do that. You've got to come in and do this big thing that you've already pre-decided.
Yes.
And sometimes that doesn't allow you that often it doesn't allow you the reactivity to the pinch points. So it's really exciting that you've managed to work with an organisation that's doing that. And I suppose it kind of moves me into a question, because you've mentioned a couple of, I think, really quite important changes that have been happening in the world of development of people and environment in the time that you've been involved. One is that move towards the recognition of local people and their own skills and knowledge. And the other is this starting to see a change in the way people, I think some organisations are thinking that actually big isn't necessarily beautiful, and actually some of the best changes might be best done by local people, but there is still a value in that external coming in and asking questions and sowing seeds or querying or telling somebody about something somewhere else. And then the third part being that trigger points, then using that to identify collectively where are those points that we can really make that difference. Does that sort of chime with?
Yes, it does. I mean, the outsider role, I mean, nothing happens without some kind of resources, whether it's people or money. The outsider tends to have the money, and to be able to ask those sometimes awkward questions. You know, you can feign stupidity and ask a really awkward question, knowing full well that it's a very, very sort of touchy subject, but they'll forgive you because you don't know. And I think also because you can bring in experiences from elsewhere, you can make the links between what a community or whatever is struggling with and a similar experience that's happened somewhere else, and try and bridge those links, or trying to learn across sort of different regions, areas, locations, communities, and I think that's important as well. But yes, I agree. I think local initiatives are really, the ownership and the energy is there, and
often a lot of the knowledge.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's some sort of pieces of a jigsaw there. I wonder whether there's anything that you sort of feel has really started to, you've seen an example of something where there's been a really big positive impact for the natural world, or for biodiversity, or for people's relationship with nature and the natural world, or just in terms of operating systems and the ways we work, in addition to the three that we've kind of mentioned.
I mean, I can bring a couple of examples. I mean, locally, lockdown changed a lot of people's relationship with their natural environment, because that was all they had, effectively. We saw it, so I live in Shrewsbury. The Raybrook Nature Reserve became full of people who you'd never normally see walking. And for a while, some friends and I were able to sort of garner that energy and bring people together as a Friends of the Raybrook group, which the local council had been trying to sort of encourage for a long time, and had never managed to find the point to get that going. We ran into issues around funding and things like that, but the Facebook group, the Friends of Facebook group, is still really active. There are people who voluntarily go litter picking, who are sort of, showing photos of things they've seen. So that energy is still there, but that was as a result of COVID and forcing everybody to rethink their situation. Another example actually was a piece of work I did in Nigeria, where the sort of the environmental issue crossed administrative boundaries, so they struggled to try and get any coherence together. As a result of the first project that I was involved with, the issue of water management was identified as being the main problem, and it actually brought everybody together. It gave everybody a common sort of point of discussion.
Yeah.
I happened to go back to the same area about 8 years later, which is very rare. You very rarely see the long-term benefits of that in a different project, but was seeing the same faces that I'd seen 8 years before, that it had sparked enough energy for people to continue to engage with that issue, whether they were still in the original sort of organisations they'd been or had set up their own. Many of them had actually set up their own organisations, and that energy was still going. And you were talking about those change and those leverage points and those touch points. Something had sparked at that first point, and it was still going. And to know that it was still going, to know that something that you don't know will have any impact at the time can actually still carry on 8 years, 10 years later, and still be moving and moving and moving, I think is encouraging.
Very, and yet I just want to pick up one word that you've used a few times. I think for me is striking as being really important, and that's the word energy. Because there's something there in all of those scenarios you've talked through, those two examples and some of the earlier things we've talked about, where the building of energy, of a positive energy, of an energy for change, and the people that are part of the change who are in that space, their energy building collectively seems to keep coming out as something that you've identified as being really important.
Yeah. No, it is, and it means I guess because you don't know what impact your actions are likely to have in the future, you may have hopes and sort of a vision of where you might want to go. I think it's important to seize opportunities when they arise. You know, that local group, okay, it might not necessarily have gone where we'd hoped it had, but that energy is still existing, and that energy is still moving forward, and that energy could potentially go in all sorts of directions, you know, in future. But it wouldn't have been there if we hadn't said, okay, you know, yes, we've got full-time jobs, we're all really busy, but we're happy to put in a bit of our own time to try and sort of bring this into some kind of focus, and to give people a place that they can bring their energy into and move things forward.
Brilliant, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got one final question for you. I can't believe we're going to any more cars and we'll be putting traffic lights in. And that is for somebody who now is sort of starting out in their career path. Do you have any suggestions for somebody who'd like to kind of go into this overlapping area that you've ended up working in with overseas development in the natural world?
I would say don't be too prescriptive about where you think you're going to go.
Right.
Be open to trying things, because to see patterns, you need to be able to see the pieces of the jigsaw, and to be open to things that you are not expecting. And the best way to do that is to try things. So keep trying. It's not necessarily easy, I think, to probably not now in terms of development.
There's not really a career
for international. No, it's not necessarily a career path, but keep trying. Keep going for things where you feel enthusiasm, because that enthusiasm will take you to places.
Well, that's really nice. That comes back to our energy thought as well, doesn't it?
Well, it does actually, and I'm not sure that was a deliberate. But that's the only way I can describe it. I never thought I would be where I am now. That was never an idea. You know, if you talked to me 16 about what I had wanted to do, or 18 or whatever, all I knew was I did want to travel, and I find really bizarre things really interesting, and I like finding things out, and that curiosity led me into, you know, I wanted to be outside. I knew I wanted to be outside, and that was the agricultural bit. That's where that started. But that was too constraining. There were lots of other really interesting things. You know, people are so complicated. You know, they can make problems really much more difficult than they need to be. And just that curiosity and all that, you know, that's an interesting, and that's a
Very good.
Yeah.
Interesting. Right. Well, I really appreciate that. Thanks,
you.
and thanks for
Well,
having
I
the
hope
interview,
it's-
springing it on you when you just thought you were coming out to look for eagles that we didn't see.
No, I think it was all a ruse.
But it's been really interesting, and I really appreciate that. And hopefully, if people want to hear more about particularly some of this overseas stuff, then it may be an area where we could look at running a bit of an online workshop with a few people, because I think it's an area that I've certainly had a lot of interesting conversations. But one thing that I would pick up at the very end there is just that thing about the inquisitive mind. And I think one of the things that's come up for me already in a lot of the discussions I've had with friends is actually how many of us are really inquisitive about what goes on around the corner, and that relationship, that love of nature and the outdoors, and that constant questioning are two of the key drivers that have kept pushing us forward. And it's great to hear so many positive things. So thanks very much for that.
Lots of stories about interesting things like that. So.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully more later.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Brilliant.
Good to see you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.